As we've discovered in some of these presentations today, one of the great limitations of much discussion around cities and city making is the misconception that to be relevant, interesting, and of value to the city, a thing must conform to a certain base level of economic value. Interventions into the city must prove their commercial right to exist. This is particularly so in the ferocious and carnivorous property market of London. A countervailing view is that there are qualities of the city that don't fit so easily into an Excel spreadsheet. There are forms of social and cultural expression that have a value that is not entirely reducible to their commercial and economic productivity. This is a territory in which the work of Nicholas Lobo Brennan and his partner Astrid Smitham of Apparata Architects play a vital role in rethinking what an urban intervention can mean and how design can be undertaken through research and exploration that can somehow hold these commercial forces a little bit at bay. Apparata Architects design and construct buildings, furniture, and books, tools for everyday life that open up unknown possibilities. Completed projects include the restructuring of a vacated listed library in Manor Park in London into a new form of public arts and studio space. Current projects include a new arts co-housing block with workshops and public events hall. Nicholas was awarded the Swiss Art Award of 2012, and his work was nominated for the 2016 Chernikov Prize. He has lectured across Europe, led a studio at the Gerhard Reichfeld Academy Amsterdam, and has taught at ETH Zurich. Indeed, Apparata is one of the small number of practices that is defined by an intimate exchange between research and other disciplinary investigations and practice outputs. Indeed, these are insoluble in their practice. Please welcome Nicholas to the stage.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for inviting me, everyone involved. It's a huge honor to be here. An incredible selection of people, if somewhat intimidating, but I am so jet-lagged that I have a feeling of bliss that I think it won't affect me. So, thanks for the introduction. It was more or less on point, I'd say. So what I'd like to do today is contribute in maybe a different way, to start off with something very, very small, which is part of a series of projects only from the last 2 years that add up to a new model of co-housing cooperative in London. So maybe I'd like to start a little bit with this idea of living cities. When we say living cities, I think everyone knows very well what those qualities are, right? It's something to do with chance, it's something to do with places with people from very different backgrounds and very different lifestyles can come together and not feel intimidated by each other. So there are qualities of city that we all know and desire. And then there's an ongoing problem of how do we make new bits of city, right? And quite often, cities made in the last few decades sometimes lack, even after 20 years or 30 years, they lack some of those qualities of what was formerly known as a city that points towards the idea that maybe our terminology is out of date and maybe we need new terms and new ideas. But at the very least, it gives us an orientation of something to aim for outside some of the things that Saskia was talking about earlier, this idea of this kind of financialized city. So a little bit about our background. The majority of our professional lives has been working within academic research units, which deal with the problem of urbanism. We were working at huge scales, working with completely new cities in South Korea, funded by a turbocharged South Korean economy. At the other end, working with Western European cities which are in a state of extreme decline, both in population and economic terms. And we were working in this very kind of broad brushstroke, top-level way, which is good in the sense that you're having to make a mix of spatial ideas, financial ideas which are related to plot size and related to who is included in that kind of planning. But urbanism, as has been highlighted just now, has its own problems, right? It has problems of what happens over time and does it result in the city that we want? And that's our kind of conclusion from a few years of work within academic research units was to think, well, maybe we can go from the other way around. It's each individual small act of architecture that can grow up through a series of scales up into new ideas for a city, particularly London in this case. And I guess in a way, the central problem that we're concerned with is the problem of problem solving. Because problem solving, I mean, if we can call design, in a sense, problem solving, which sounds good, you know, I've got a problem and I'll solve it, but it is inherently a discrete thing. It can only take into account what it's concerned with, right? And some of the problems that arise could be like Liam was pointing out, the problem of the phone, right? You design a phone to solve certain things, but then it has impacts beyond its physical limits, right? Then you have the problem of the financial product that was pointed out before, that it's there to solve a particular problem, but it causes more problems than it solves. So we're sort of very interested in that idea of the problem of problem solving being what is under consideration when you design something. So we've undertaken, alongside other projects, more commercial projects or whatever, a series of projects over the last 2 years where we work with particular groupings of stakeholders, I guess you'd call them. So situations where there's a community, there's local government, and there's city government, but there's no money around, right? Because one of the conclusions from working in the research units is that the spending of money doesn't make good cities, right? It's not that the more you spend on square meters, the more you spend on consultants, the more rich and varied and better the city would be. An example which I have to be a bit careful to state, but earlier there was a slide about, it looked like Brazil to me, but there was a favela, a shantytown in relation to a new development, and the new development followed all the rules and norms of contemporary urbanism. And the informal settlement, although is a social problem, I think it's a mistake if European architects go and say it's somehow super interesting, and that's it. Although it is a social problem, it does have certain qualities of an authentic city, right? And so I guess what that says is that money is not the key issue, let's say, to a certain extent. So by working with groups of communities and several stakeholders, we wanted to make the problem of problem solving a bit wider. So to do that, we undertook a few things. We became a main contractor, to be able to take a bit more agency, let's say. It allowed us to control budgets, allowed us to control various types of administrative fee that get lost in a project. It also allowed us to take on a bit more firmly the problem of services, because they're increasingly a large part, our buildings are increasingly cyborgs with an increasing amount of machinery. And it also allowed us to become involved with the financing of projects. So in these arrangements, one of the parties involved is borrowing, one is spending, and one is occupying. So one thing before starting is that relationship between the space and the occupier. This is a photo of London. If you know London, there'll be a very distinctive thing that's familiar to that. I don't know if you have it here, but this photo, which is taken at the edge of the city of London, that sort of zone where the city of London has crept into other boroughs and created these kind of new private lands. But the thing that is most interesting in this photo is the most banal, the most boring thing. It's the double yellow lines, which are parking restrictions. And we find this a kind of intriguing, very London-based idea, but it extends as a kind of description of City General, is that the double yellow line is there to tell you where not to park, right? So it's very instructive, don't do this, don't do that. And that logic spreads across into the privately held land on the right, where you have security guards saying, don't do this, don't do that. So London has become a very kind of instructive space of that tells you things you can and cannot do. A very simple thing that could be done is in London, perhaps we only mark where you can park rather than putting lines everywhere where you can't park. And this sort of simple twist on a logic we think would make for richer, more inviting city spaces, but also that's the kind of required logic where cities and buildings should be more intuitive and more open to unexpected occupation rather than instructed occupation. Does this one work now? Oh, okay. Okay, great. No, got it. It's worked.
Oh, did?
No, I think I got it. Okay. I'll try and keep it relatively short because it's been a long day already. But so this is a project in Newham, one of the poorest boroughs in London. And this is a library, formerly a public library that had been shut for the best part of a decade because the local council no longer had the money to maintain it. It had leaks, it had all kinds of problems that were sort of semi-hidden and made it, unfortunately, impossible for them to carry on using it. They moved the library down to a new build building down the road. The new build building I'm not showing, but it's extremely poor quality building with a short lifespan, very low ceilings. It kind of has all the qualities of bad architecture and bad urbanism, which is in stark contrast to this building, which is in its own sort of odd, muscular little way, a kind of glorious small building in a very poor neighborhood. It's worth pointing out that this building is a Carnegie Passmore library, which was part of a philanthropic culture at the end of the 1800s, being the 1900s, where a series of publicly serving typologies were invented or created along with housing and other types. And those inventions within the private sector, even though it's not for profit, became the typological basis for the welfare state in Britain. And the welfare state continued with some success through to the end of the 70s, and since then there's been discussion of what's included and what's not included. And that's kind of where our projects sit. They sit at that cusp between public amenity and how's it paid for within a kind of economy that hasn't been set up to support them. Okay, so the neighborhood itself is in the bottom 0.5% in term, or it's one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. It's one of the most Muslim neighborhoods in the country. But what's particularly interesting about it is the high street has been completely resistant to chains. So there isn't a McDonald's there. There is one supermarket chain and one gambling shop. But otherwise, within this high street, you can get everything you need. So the community is extremely rich and strong with an awful lot of social and economic bonds. Because everything you need is there. There is literally no need to go to out-of-town shopping strips like IKEA. You even can buy every conceivable building product you could possibly want. And this is a kind of London that more or less doesn't exist anymore. It's one of the very few bits of London that is something like London of the 1990s and further back. And it's kind of resisted gentrification, which we won't go into the reasons for that, but that is related to the physical layout of the neighborhood. And so we were asked by an organization and a group of artists to try and help this building become public again, as in both usable for local residents, but also capable of hosting arts. So we developed with them. And this is the general condition of the building. This photo, seemingly unimportant, is relatively important because it describes a lot of the problems with contemporary construction. The building originally is a kind of breathing building in a sort of a natural building system almost. And in this room, you have plastic plates, plastic floors, which has caused the building to essentially rot from the inside. So the project was, in the first part, removing all these, all the logic of contemporary building, or all the elements of contemporary building, to return it to a natural breathing building. Of course, it still had moments of beauty, which we wanted to work with, this kind of geometries and special light. And we proposed that they should keep the front room, which is the furthest forward room there, as a public room, and the back and the upstairs and the rear of the building to be used as studios, which fund the curated content within the front, to be able to fund basically the local community were and are lacking a community centre. So this would be a place where events with local children, families, vulnerable adults would have a place to come and have community events. And our basic architectural idea was to make a connection from the front of the building to the back of the building, to make a kind of mixing chamber, which is the yellow part. And this mixing chamber meant that you have a public spine going from back to front, and then you have a very strong relationship between the studios either side. And that part becomes a kind of semi-educational area, because the people within the studios contribute to a kind of teaching program within the building. So this is the building as we found it. It would have had previously, as is commonly in Edwardian architecture, the use of timber and glass partitions to make subdivisions within the space. It would never have been this open. So we inserted a series of these glass and timber partitions to keep the logic, if not the style, to make this kind of room-to-room plan, which means that we are resisting the idea of using a corridor and try to give the quality of the plan the qualities of a city, which is a place of chance meeting. So here we inserted these glass partitions. These become these kind of mixing chambers. So for this project, because it was so horrifically low, the budget, you'd be shocked if I said, we had to sort of invent a method with them of how could this project happen. So we reserved a certain portion of the budget for skilled craftsmen to make the timber parts. And then as a kind of community endeavor, we stripped and painted the rest of the building, which also helps link the community to the very building itself. I mean, the people who were there most on site are the people who are most there within the building. But that was as much as part of the project, coming up with, well, how do we do this with almost no money? But in these projects, this particular series of projects, even though we're trying to work with things that extend beyond the remit of the problem solving of the architect, we tried to make sure that architecture as a kind of tectonic art is present through the project, even in a sort of socially engaged project. So here, this is a kind of idea about how new meets old. And this is an example of, once you strip back the building, you end up with this kind of mess. So we thought the whole floor would have to go, but it didn't have to go if you dried it. So we inserted the cheapest means possible to replace those rotten parts, which creates a kind of accidental ornamentation. Okay. And the building's completely occupied now. It's quite interesting that you get this local community having contact with a new community of artists, and the consequence has been a series of publications have been made in collaboration between the two. So this is not really an act of gentrification where you replace a population, it's an act of where you combine two populations to, in the true sense of real city, create new cultures. Okay, then this is a small project that I think is worth showing from a formal point of view, because the first project ends up being the ground floor of the final project I'll show. But this project is a kind of study into, it's kind of a diagram, a kind of, in a sense, a kind of model what a public space could be. So this is in Venice at the moment, at the Biennale, if you find yourself over there. And we were talking with the curators about how do we make a public space, a common space, a kind of a space which is understood as commonly held within the Biennale, which is a kind of endless parade of interesting things, let's say, right? And this, so we set around this idea of the frame and what's the least you can possibly do in like a formal sense, which is this, effectively, right? So you produce a kind of void in the middle and a series of street spaces around the edge. And the idea being that architecture can be quite effortless in its formal moves and still create complexity in a kind of sense of the city. So this is the structure there. It was a series of trusses, effectively, three-dimensional trusses, which hold up a 2-ton box on 2 legs. And the idea being that on one part, denial is as much as as important as connection. And the other idea being that it kind of recalls some kind of ideas of a municipal hall, but having a kind of partial vision becomes a way to make a kind of urban environment, even though it's an interior. So you get this kind of edge, this crust of activities, and then this kind of void in the middle. Just go through. Okay, then two more projects. So this is a project where we worked with an organization who had a bit of land, or they had a few buildings here, effectively. And they're an arts organization, extremely good arts organization, very grassroots, who on the one hand provide very cheap spaces for artists, but also provide a kind of gallery and community space for the surrounding area. But they had hit upon a terrible problem, which is a London problem, is that their rents were being doubled. And this is a problem across the board in London. Basically, London is kind of strangling itself in terms of places for creative activity. The creative industries contribute something like 30 billion a year, but the average income of an artist is about £10,000 a year. So there's this incredible discrepancy. So British or London-based artists are moving either to the coast or to Berlin or to LA or wherever. It could almost be anywhere. So this is a kind of terrible problem where the success of London, which was to have, previously it was to have a kind of excess of space, which means you have a kind of cheapness of space, was an incredible vessel for helping some of the greatest work of the 20th century develop. And that's all disappearing. And this is one of the last bastions. This is the entrance. And it's a collection of buildings, some formerly religious buildings, some industrial buildings. And they had this kind of idea that they thought they had to knock down the building and build a shiny new white gallery space. One, they really didn't have the money, and two, it would have destroyed everything that was great about the building, this kind of authenticity that when you're building anew, it's very difficult to recreate. So with them, we developed this idea, well, what's the relationship between your financial situation and your spatial needs and the character of what you have? And the building itself is basically a series of roofs standing upon light roofs standing upon heavy walls. So here's an example. And the problem they had is that they could never fit enough studios in, and they couldn't fit more community support spaces, which they needed to gain grants. And at the same time, they didn't have money to knock down a building and build a new, and also that would have destroyed the project. So we proposed them, this is their plan, that we just insert 2 volumes, 2 courtyard volumes, which are 2-story, And that would generate enough income for them to survive in contemporary London for the next 25 years. And then a series of spaces around it are created, these street spaces, a bit like the one I just showed you before, this idea that you make an object that creates spaces around it which are as important as the object itself. And so this was the idea. So we proposed to take the roof off, and the idea is that we put a new flat roof on top, but we use the existing walls as foundations above ground. Because part of the problem, the cost would be to build, to have foundations and piles, and the disturbance and planning issues with that would have been enormous. So we proposed that we just add 2 buttresses, which are the large diagonal pieces, and we just sit very lightly a roof on top, which doubles their capacity and more than quadruples the amount of available community space. And this is somehow this line of projects where we're trying to get the full completeness of the problem to be the driver of the project. So these are some other parts of the project with lifted roofs and new studios. And then the final project, which is what this is all working towards. This is a housing project in Barking and Dagenham, which is the far east of London. The site is right there. The main station is there, and then there's this new development, and it's bound on 2, almost 3 that you can't see off site, bound on 3 sides that makes it a pretty badly connected area, but extremely close to a fantastic high street. So this project, like the other ones, we've been working with the Greater London Authority to develop these new kind of financial and design models. This is part of this ongoing research. This is a first step towards a more generalized model that tries to reserve the finance of the project in larger portion for the facade, because the facade is the part in London, at least, that usually gets cut, and you end up with these quite miserable facades, as you pointed out. And in the end, the facade is the bit that is the gift to the locality, is the main point that has an impact upon the neighborhood. So the neighborhood itself is extremely successful, actually. Again, it's not a rich neighborhood. It's one of the poorest, maybe the poorest, second poorest borough in London. But it has an extremely rich social life, market life. The neighborhood is characterized by these sort of 70s blocks and these older 2-story, 3-story pitch roof brick blocks. And it's really bound on several sides by some quite heavy infrastructure work. The new development itself tries to make a kind of new, sort of local or tries to go with what the local vernacular is, these kind of blocks and these buildings. The site is there, in between all these buildings. What's important is this horizon, within the next 5 years, will be filled with 20-plus story buildings, which is part of a developer's plan to make these kind of, I guess, aiming towards these kind of financialized building products. Whereas the council are going the opposite direction. They're trying to buy up as much possible as land to keep cool the local rents. So we're working with them on that, on this small model that would be rolled out at a larger scale afterwards. So the same with the other projects. We went through a project of consultation, which means the immediate locality, the people within the building, and even people that are beyond the neighborhood who might be interested in using it. And so that kind of brief consultation becomes the formula for what the form of the building is. Here we're thinking about the idea that artists have lived for centuries in effectively light industrial units because of their ability to be very adaptable, and you can kind of create your own way of living within them, and then a series of things that a local community might need. So this is the building in the middle. If you see to the back, there are these blocks, increasingly tall blocks, and to the side, there's these low-rise. So the building itself is somehow related to both of them. It uses its blockiness and also use a series of cuts and additions. Here it is here, soon to be surrounded by these. We were always inspired by a particular drawing we saw in Brazil, where São Paulo was always predicted to have been a city of towers, or being predicted since the 1970s, which is increasingly what's happened in London and will happen in this neighborhood. But there's a series of drawings by an architect that declared, if you make something small, make it strong, which means both materially robustly, but in terms of its character, so it can have it hold its own against the towers. So this is the building here in the concrete, textured concrete. It's going to go on site just at the end of the year, basically. And the basic idea is that you make a public ground floor, which is a series of stones, effectively, or we call them stones, and the glazing can open up completely. So in certain times of year, the ground floor of the building is completely open, which is different for a residential building because the residential building isn't usually expected to fulfill those kind of roles, but because this is a public building and a residential building, it has to have the character of both those two types. And so from the block, we make a series of cuts to give it the form and to give it a variation in apartment types, but we make these additions on the outside, these canopies, which is somehow related to new developments we'd seen, which are completely flush and completely impossible to occupy even briefly because of wind problems and because of rain. So we thought a building from the beginning can offer even occupation that lasts only minutes, moments. The other thing just to say is that we've kept the glazing away from the facade, which is important in the sense that we didn't want to have this kind of feeling of a kind of tight skin, and have it speak a little bit more of the fact it's mineral, speak about its weight, speak about its permanence, but also offer collective spaces through the building. So the first collective space is on this ground floor. And then as you go up through the building, this is a typical floor. You have a basic unit like this, which is, in the UK, quite a difficult thing to do, this unit, because of the regulations, how they are, you're forced more or less to make a corridor, and a corridor that eats into an awful lot of space. So the objective of the project was to, within the local restrictions, make corridorless apartments, and the advantage of those is that they are adaptable. So you can add walls and take away walls where you might like. And then around the perimeter are a kind of front shared patio loggia, and at the back a more kind of private balcony. But the idea being that as you come through the building, you always share this space with your neighbors. The other point is that the living rooms are connected by a series of double doors that acoustically perform to the right level, but it offers the opportunity to make a kind of co-housing that, on the one hand, can be very useful for particularly a floor with young families who want to share childcare, for instance, but it's also something you can undo very quickly. You just close the doors and you don't have co-housing anymore. But effectively, you just get a core and that's it. And the building's so simple to build that it reserves far more of the budget than typical for the facade. So these are the different scenarios of things you could possibly do with more or less walls. So from the young couple to the family of 4 on this side who've inserted 2 walls. Each one of those rooms are just matching norms. Obviously, the typology also offers incredible variety in the sense that you can make larger apartments and smaller apartments. And the ambition is, once this is built, to make larger buildings that have vertical and horizontal connections through what is a very simple spatial 3D matrix. So this is one of the aggregated rooms where you have corridor and 2 rooms added into 1 room, which for London is extremely generous, the high ceilings as well. But this is all to do with basically manipulating the budget. This is when they're connected through. And this is a model of the ground floor, where it's this idea that you have a series of, to make it this kind of open, welcoming public floors, you have a series of stones which are kind of stitched together with a kind of fabric of glass, almost all of which will be completely openable, meaning that the building can go from being a completely kind of conventional ground floor to being this kind of almost impossible, completely concrete playground. So this is what the ground floor will look like in the end. It's a series of large shapes that offer just the right enough of protection from the street, but also offer this kind of openness. And then here what you see, which is you see this kind of inner building, which is the glazed part, which makes these different shapes to make these kind of micro public spaces around the edge of the building, thereby making that ground floor a kind of little urbanism in itself. And that's it.